Okay, let's try to be here now. The place where everything happens, but the place that never seems like it's enough. We always think the future is going to be better, but all that is needed for wholeness, for freedom, is in the now. So, loving God, we seek to accept this now, this moment, where you are and where we want to be. We thank you for these sisters and brothers. We come here today seeking wisdom. We ask for your guidance, and we ask that we can be good listeners. We pray gratefully in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, as I told you a few days ago, this talk is now the counterpart to the one we gave you on liberation theology. But in many ways, of the two talks, this is really the more demanding, or if you want to use the word, the more radical. I think the contemplative mind is the most absolute assault on the secular worldview that you can have, because it really is a different mind. And what we've been doing, I think this has been the failure of so much of liberalism, is it has been trying to critique from really the same mind. And that'll make more sense later. But it's still what I'm going to call the calculative mind, or the calculating mind. It's the egocentric mind that reads everything in terms of personal advantage, in terms of usually short-term effect, in terms of what's in it for me and how will I look and how will I look good. As long as you read reality from that small self, and read everything calculatively, I don't think you're going to see things in any really new way. Maybe you'll move along the political spectrum from left to right or right to left. But what all the great religions have talked about is a different way of seeing that is actually a different perspective, a different vantage point, a different starting point. I use often Albert Einstein's quote. He said, "No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused it." Now what we're trying to do is solve our problems by the same consciousness that caused them. Which read everything in terms of cause and effect and personal advantage. The word contemplation really only became popular again through really Thomas Merton's writings in the 50s and 60s. Probably a lot of religions use the word meditation. Actually, the word most Christians are familiar with is simply the word prayer. But the word prayer became, unfortunately, in the West, like everything did in the West, became something functional, something you did, again, to achieve a desired effect. Which puts you back in charge. As soon as you make prayer a way to get something, and listen to most prayers, that's what they are, and it's okay. I think God's used to it by now. But it's really not any kind of new state or new consciousness. It's the same old consciousness. How can I get God to do what I want God to do? And so maybe I'll talk to him about it. Cure my grandma. Well, I guess if he gets enough, he's probably counting, or she's probably counting. How many cure my grandmas do I get? And if I get enough of them, I'll do it. But that's where most people are at with prayer. It's not really a change of consciousness. It's the egocentric self deciding what it needs and what it wants, and resorting to what we now call a higher power, because you can't get any better than that, to get on your side to get what you want. Huh? So you can basically remain an untransformed, egocentric person who's just now, instead of manipulating everybody else, which is all the ego can do, is it now tries to manipulate God. Now that's why at least one reason I think religion is in such desperate straits today. Because it really isn't transforming people. It's merely giving people some pious and religious ways to again be in charge and to again be in control. It's still the small self. And what a genuine religion is talking about is a transformed self. It's a different I. Paul uses that wonderful phrase, I live no longer, not I. It's a different I, a different sense of self that's here. I think until you've come to that, you're not at foundational transformation. You might be pious, you might be denominational, you might be religious in the way the term is normally used, you might belong to some group, but it's still what we'll call the small self. Let me use a quote I've been using now for the last 3 years, I think, from Ken Wilber. This is in his set of journal entries called One Taste. And he says, religion has always performed two very important but very different functions. First, it acts as a way of creating meaning for the separate self. It offers myths, stories, tales, narratives, rituals, and revivals that, taken together, help the separate self to make sense of and to endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And that's okay. That's how you got to get started. As the psychologist would say, you got to have an ego to let go of an ego. You got to have a self to move beyond the self. But what most religion does is it stops at that first function of simply giving you a positive self-image. That I'm a religious person, or I'm a moral person, or I'm a dedicated person, or whatever it might be. This function of religion does not usually or necessarily change the level of consciousness in a person. It does not deliver radical transformation. It does not deliver a shattering liberation from the separate self. It consoles the self, fortifies the self, defends the self, and promotes the self. I talked to some mediators some years ago who work with major corporations, and they said that they reserve their very best educated people in the work of mediation to work with churches. Because church people tend to be the most opinionated, right? Hard to work with people. They'd sooner work with the business world than with church people. Because church people are all convinced they're right. I mean, that's the whole point of religion, to make sure you're right. And once you start with that starting point, to make sure I'm right, it has disastrous effects. Religion is the worst thing in the world, and it's the best thing in the world at the same time. If it stops at the first function of religion, which I think most religion does, it's the worst thing in the world. All it creates is highly egocentric people, and they have the most clever cover for their egocentricity. They're egocentric for God. They're egocentric for morality, or for the church, or for piety, or for, flag and country, or something like that. They're usually, you can't touch them, because the ego is a hardened silo. It's sure that it's right. Now he says, as long as the separate self believes the myths, performs the rituals, mouths the prayers, embraces the dogma, then the self, it is fervently believed, will be saved. We're not really sure what that's supposed to mean, but everybody uses the word rather glibly, being saved. I suppose in most Western Christians' mind it means going to heaven, that I'm going to get some reward later for doing this. And the whole thing is, I always call it a very bad reward-punishment novel. It's preposterous that anybody believes it, but if you haven't really worked with it, and I'm just lucky enough to have had time to work with it, you believe it because everybody else does. And you think, well, this many people can't be wrong, they must be right. Life is a giant reward-punishment system. And if you jump the hoops right, you'll get the reward. It's not about transformation. Can you feel the difference? You don't have to be transformed. You just have to play the game right. And this is what we're dealing with today. Now he goes on, and he says, religion has also served in a usually very, very small minority. His analysis is pessimistic. The function of radical transformation and liberation. This function of religion does not fortify the separate self, but utterly shatters it. Not consolation, but devastation. Not entrenchment, but emptiness. Now, this is why your great spiritual teachers will always talk about descent, the way of the cross, emptiness, letting go. Not complacency, but devastation. Not entrenchment, but emptiness. Not complacency, but explosion. Not comfort, but revolution. In short, not a conventional bolstering of consciousness, but a radical transmutation and transformation of consciousness at its deepest level. That is what we mean by religious conversion. Now, how that normally happens is by what we'd call a God encounter, where your natural egocentricity is undercut. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore. In other words, you have to find a center outside of yourself that is in fact the center. Up to that point, you're eccentric, and you're off center, and most people are eccentric. You're not the center of the world at all, but you act as if you are. Everything is, do I like it? Do I want it? Do I look good? Is my name on it? You know, who cares? But a lot of people do. That's all they have, you know. It seems like someone took my markers here. You know? Maybe they're in here. Here they are. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is try to give you two different diagrams. So we can understand this. It almost takes a simple imaging of it. And it really is very simple. Maybe you'll even say simplistic. But I'm going to call this the false self. Now this is, I'm afraid, what we're doing a lot of times is we're baptizing the false self, we're ordaining the false self, we're giving communion to the false self. The false self is this little autonomous thing over here that tries to dress itself up, fortify itself, as we just said, make itself look Christian or Catholic or religious or whatever it wants to be, or moral. Now people like Jesus come along, and in the presence of that they say, lest the grain of wheat die, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it will bear much fruit. Or he'll say, the branch cut off from the vine is useless. That's a really strong statement. It's useless. He goes even further. He says, you might as well throw it into the fire. It's a waste of time working with this thing. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. He's largely working with this false self. And the way we start, we all start here, there probably, and God certainly understands this, is we gaze at our navel and see, are we doing it right? And the question always is, how do I get over here? Now over here, I guess you could call this God, heaven, eternity, the truth, the mystery. And the question is, what are the rules, what are the rituals, what are the practices that I can perform to get God to like me? That's where, in effect, everybody starts. They wouldn't put it in those words, all right? But everybody does. And it's an okay starting place. It's just not a good continuing place. And it's a terrible ending place. Now I want to right away, because we're going to jump back and forth to understand these, because this is necessary, by the way, to understand contemplation and the contemplative mind, we're going to draw the true self. This is the only self that's ever existed. It's the only self that exists right now. The trouble is, most people don't know it. They really don't. And the work of religion is to get you to know this. Religio, the very word means to rebind, to reconnect. You came forth from God. Your deepest DNA is divine. You are not human beings trying to become spiritual. That's how everybody starts. You are already spiritual beings. And the profound question is how to be human. I believe that's why Jesus came as a human being. Not to teach us how to go to heaven, to teach us how to be a human being here on this earth. Can you imagine how different the history of Western Christianity would have been if we would have concentrated on teaching Christians how to be human beings in this world? Instead of all this heaven talk. Remember I said in the first prayer, it's all about now, about how you do it now. We took all the power out of the now, and we put all the power into the future. Everything was a reward, punishment, was going to happen later. And so now was sort of a game, or an obstacle course, or a testing ground, that you really didn't take it in itself seriously. It's all play acting, and hopefully playing it right so that you get the reward later. So here I have the small self, and you can call it that if you want. Psychologically, Jung would call this the small self and call this the great self with a big S. When the small self knows that it has no meaning, no foundation, apart from who it is in God, that's transformation. When I live, no longer not I, you see. That is a different experience of the self. Just as you have a heart transplant, this is an identity transplant. Just as you have a lung transplant or a liver transplant, it is I can't say it's strong enough, it's a different sense of the I. A different sense of the self. A different sense of the who that you are. I always love to say, excuse me, we got to get the who right. Who are we? Who are we? And most people don't know. They think they are this private self. This Richard thing, this Ben thing, this Judy thing, this Susan thing, all of which is fine. But Merton says it so well. He says, one thing for sure about heaven, there won't be much of you there. In other words, the you that you think is you, this little thing, now this is secular consciousness. This is the world we live in today. This is what people, that's all you have. And so you have to dress it up. You have to defend it. You can make a pretty general statement. Whenever you're defensive, it's always the false self. This self is so secure, it never has any, it doesn't have any, there's nothing to defend, if you follow me. There's nothing to be offended. And I tell many people, that's how you know you're living in the false self at that moment, if you take offense at anything. If you took offense in the kitchen at Tepeyac this morning because someone didn't clean up after themselves. I mean, I probably would have too. But don't do it for more than 15 seconds, you know. Because for more than 15 seconds, that's just your little insecure self that needs to be pampered or needs to define itself by cleanliness or whatever it might be, or order, you know. This self is pretty unoffendable. It really is. It's just, I can see why the Bible said, don't let the sun go down on your anger. You'll get angry for a few minutes, but you can't identify with it. You can't feed it. You don't let it possess you, as I said last week. Now, the rules here are sort of the rules of what I'm going to call requirement religion. It's always looking for what are the correct requirements. And every religion is convinced that it has the correct requirements. It forces you toward legalism and ritualism eventually. Here, it's not about requirements, it's about relationship. The quality and your capacity for relatedness. Now, I hope you can see how I'm laying the foundation for contemplation. Because this self will say prayers, but this self is a prayer. Just by being, just by walking from here to there, it is a prayer. Now that's why Paul can say something like, pray always. He can't mean walking around saying Our Fathers and Hail Marys, huh? But how you can pray always is when you live in conscious union with God. It's really not. This is the surprise for most people. It's really not about being perfect. This self will still make mistakes, but it lives from a center other than its own. Now, until and unless you've met a centered person, a grounded person, who you can tell their center is outside themselves, it's almost hard to get the feel for this. You have to have met a saint. In fact, my definition of Christianity in recent years has been a Christian is someone who's met one. That this whole thing is contagious. Huh? When you meet a person of a certain quality of maturity, that's how you get maturity. Yeah? You meet a patient person and you learn how to be patient. You meet a loving person and you learn how to be loving. That's the way human beings operate. You don't even know how to do it. Huh? And it's the same way with this. When you meet a really grounded, happy, free person, you can just feel the water rise. You become more like that because you'll be satisfied with nothing less. That becomes the reference point or the criteria. This whole thing spreads, like a contagion, really. But it spreads through relationship, by the quality of one's relationship. Now, what we'd say is happening in prayer is you're experiencing that quality of relationship with God, where you know you're not being manipulated, you're not being used, you're not being judged, you're not being evaluated. Boy, who wouldn't go there? I mean, that's just the place of ultimate freedom. That's the state that every one of us wants to live in. So that's why we tell people, go pray a half an hour a day or whatever it might be, because you live in this place. You become this. It's sort of that simple. It rubs off on you. I don't know what other way to say it. So I want to say as strongly as I can that all of the institutes of religion, Bible, sacraments, priesthood, churches, everything, rosary, way of the cross, contemplative, sit, is to help you experience this self. Pure and simple. That's all. And if your religion isn't helping you experience this self, then change it. Or get rid of it, or do something different. If it's maintaining you in this self, then we got a problem. And a lot of religion is. This is the religion that fought Jesus, because it was all into dogmatism and requirements. And when Jesus wasn't following their dogmas and requirements, they had to get rid of him. So if this is about requirement, this is not just about relationship, but it's about right relationship. How do you connect in a way that's really connection? This is about being correct. Do you see? Am I correct? Am I right? I always say you'd think the first commandment was, thou shalt be right. It's not about being correct, it's about being connected. Connected. Unless the vine is connected, or the branch is connected to the vine, we have a problem. Now, how does God achieve this? This is the process of transformation. What life will do to you anyway, but most people don't have the freedom to recognize it and to allow it. What life will do to you, and I'm going to use religious language and say God will do it to you. God has to, in the course of your years, destabilize that private ego. The word for that is suffering. Mental suffering, emotional suffering, physical suffering, relational suffering, things that you can't fix, that you can't control, that you can't explain, you can't change. There is no way. And you got to be honest at this point. Your ego is not going to give up until it has to. You know that. You know that. It's not, as long as you're goody two-shoes and looking good and feeling good and everybody's admiring you and you're the best Catholic in Oregon, I mean, why would you change? You're feeling quite well without God, thank you. Oh, you're very pious. You're very religious, but you don't really need God. You're admiring your own advancement, your own maturity, so-called, you see. So God has to let you fail. Now, I always say, therefore, there are two people who have a head start in the spiritual life. Or two groups of people, sinners and mystics. Mystics are those who, in this inner journey, consciously let go of those ego boundaries and collapse back in to who they really were anyway, but didn't know it. You are this right now, all right? That's all you've ever been, but hardly anybody knows it, do you see? And what you're doing in your contemplative sit is consciously experiencing that. Not knowing it through the head level, experiencing it through the body, gut level. It has to be experienced. You can't teach people this. Even though I'm trying to tell you right now, all right? You won't believe me. You will leave here and live just like you always did until you know this for yourself. And then it's not a matter of belief. I don't believe this. I know this. It's not a matter of, people think religion is believing unbelievable things. It is believing unprovable things. But these things can clearly be experienced. Where you know it, it's the only thing that finally makes sense of what's happening.